Welcome to Lloyd's Future Set Business Leaders Series. And I'm dead excited today to have Tanya Steele with me, who's got such an interesting career both in the private sector with BT and Siemens, and then, goodness me, in the charity sector with the World Wildlife Fund. So when we take a step back and think of the macro debate we're trying to have on climate, nature, biodiversity, what does that mean in a WWF context? What are the challenges and what's front of mind for you today?
I mean, I guess in front of many of our minds, not just WWF, of course, it's climate. And we know from a climate change perspective, we're not just hearing about it, we're seeing the impacts all over the world. And ultimately, one of the biggest concerns we have from a WWF point of view is this isn't just about climate. And I say just carefully, this is about climate, but also biodiversity and nature, because it's two sides of the same coin. And so we can see the climate crisis, but there is at times quite an unseen nature and wildlife crisis that has been unfolding for the last 50, 60 years. I mean, the last WWF report, the Living Planet report, highlighted that we'd lost average wildlife populations of 69%.
Wow.
If we were to do a human equivalence of that, that would be the equivalent of wiping out the entire human populations in Africa, the Americas, Europe, China, and Oceania. So it's huge shifts that we're seeing globally, and it's not just about the sad loss of wildlife, it represents the ecosystems that they live on.
Sure.
And we know how much we rely on a healthy natural environment, not just for our economy, but for our very ability to live and to survive and to live well.
Do you think, I mean, you make such an interesting point, because even for me, not having had your experience, it worries me that we split the debate of climate. Climate's easy to invest against, isn't it? I mean, we understand from our business backgrounds, you know, there is an investable proposition, therefore the money's there. Is the same true for nature and biodiversity? Do we need to pull the discussion back together again? Is that part of the answer?
We absolutely do. It is ultimately two sides of the same coin. Yeah. There is no viable pathway to a 1.5 degree world, effectively a world in which we will attempt to slow down and reduce the impacts of warming that we know are already happening, unless we have more nature on the planet than we do today. So looking at those two in terms of how they work together, and nature's ultimately our greatest ally in the fight against climate change. I mean, all our wetlands, our soils, our grasslands, our forests, our oceans.
Our food.
Our food.
Yeah.
These are critical, but many of those natural systems are already working really hard for us for free, absorbing all these excess greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, in the last decade alone, it's estimated that our natural systems have absorbed over 50% of all man-made greenhouse gas emissions. So looking after those systems, respecting those systems is going to be really important. And as we also know, certainly again in our fight against climate change, so it's how do we both protect it, how do we ensure we actually start to restore our natural systems, and then really importantly, how do we ensure that we're not pushing them to the brink where we're seeing them moving to the edge of what we call some really, really dangerous tipping points. So we've got an incredible job to do. And I see the private sector, I see financial institutions, insurers as a critical part in doing that.
I'm going to come back to you on financial sector and what we might do. So looking through a WWF lens, I mean, we all know who the WWF is. Is the profile as strong? Do you feel you're getting the financial support that you need? Is that coming your way? Is your story understood? Are people listening to you?
I think the story is much better understood, even over the last 3, 4, 5 years. And this is through a combination of how it's reported in the news, how we see and consume it ourselves, how we see it on the television screens in terms of a whole range of natural history series and big biopic events. So I think it's understood, but people can often get a bit frozen in terms of what to do. And the reality is, whilst funding flows may be moving towards and supporting not just environmental organisations, but those communities, the reality is the greater pressure comes on our day-to-day actions and consumption. This is in terms of whether it's our food systems, this is the very fibres that we wear. And the truth is that we have to address that. We have to rewire our economies in a way that ensures we keep a really good balance of nature and our natural ecosystems. But also, of course, we're providing food for growing populations, providing resources on a fair basis. So that's the real trick in terms of how do we rewire our economies to do that really well.
It's interesting even for us. I mean, a couple of the topics that we've got involved in, I'm going to come back to how we can help you. So when we look at regenerative agriculture, even here in the UK, we're trying to think through an insurance and finance lens. How can we help even the farming community here make the investment decision they've got to make to give them the certainty that they won't fail in terms of their ability to produce the crop and make a living for themselves. And similarly, actually, we've done the same with the UN and the Capital Development Fund that sits with the UN when we look at the emerging countries of the world, how they deal with the climate-related challenges they've got. So, Tanya, let's go back to where we were a few moments ago, and you've sort of begun to sort of turn the guns a little bit on us, the financial services and insurance. So if you were to ask us, if we took a financial services lens or even an insurance lens within that, what can we do now to help you?
I think you can do an awful lot. I mean, I'm a great believer as leading WWF. When you see a problem downstream, you need to get up and walk right the way up to source. And when we consider the nature of the role of financial institutions, of insurers, you are institutional investors and you are underwriters. So your ability to influence the system in a way that minimises risk, generates return, but ultimately helps rewire their economy on a basis that means that we've got a healthy, prosperous and stable future for the entire planet is really significant. And of course there's a whole range of moves that are helping with that. It isn't just the discourse on climate change, on nature loss. We saw at COP26, the then UK Chancellor announced City of London here to be the first net zero financial centre. And of course the role now in terms of transition plans and sitting on that task force, WWF sits on that task force, and to see those transition plans coming to light. So both as investors and actually working through that with clients, actually what pathway are they on? Are they moving quickly enough? And you talked as an example earlier in terms of the role of food and farming is huge. We're seeing the energy transition, that's moving. It feels unstoppable. There's some bumps in the road, we know, in terms of fossil fuel investment, but ultimately that feels an unstoppable transition. If we look at food and farming, it's well over a quarter of global emissions. That needle has not moved in decades. And ultimately, this isn't about criticising food businesses, it's certainly not about criticising farmers, but they can be real heroes in this transition. And we know there are the tools and the techniques, but we need to ensure that the way in which the investment flows, the way in which they're measured, but also some of the support mechanisms from insurability and risk management, that has to be at the heart of this transition too. So it's definitely, there's some risk, but there's a tremendous business opportunity there as well.
I think, and we were chatting a little bit about it before we sat down, when you think of our respective involvement with the Sustainable Markets Initiative, I think the two lenses for insurance you've touched on, insurers have an unusual pot of money. A quarter of the money in financial institutions in the world sits with insurers. So there is the investable opportunity, there is the insurance capability. I think there is the influencing point, which is where you were going, because I think, when we think about the debate around climate, nature and biodiversity, as you've said several times, it's the same conversation. I think we've all got a responsibility, starting at government and then through the private sector, to bring those conversations back together again, and then everything becomes investable. And I think genuinely, and you've been saying it, I think there's such an opportunity to create consumption with it as well, which creates further investment. So I'm with you. I think there is the opportunity to get this right. So just thinking, how are you feeling positive? Is your optimism intact? Are you anxious?
I'm always a glass half full in terms of perspective. But we need to be honest, the clock is ticking. It's ticking, and the speed at which we need to make this move and this transition it has to step up. I often talk to boards, non-execs, chairs, and often they'll say, look, please, can we just deal with the carbon and the climate issues? We'll then come to nature and biodiversity. I'm like, whoa. You can't do that. You cannot afford to wait. Not only are we wiping out decades of development of communities, we know they're going to go backwards, but actually they are so intrinsically connected that realistically, as complex as it is, we need to put those great minds around the table to really start to transition and work on this. And we can't really avoid the potential of tipping points in some of the major Earth systems. I mean, if we look at someone like the Amazon, we talk about it as the lungs of the Earth.
Yep.
It controls huge parts of this planet's weather systems. For an ecosystem like that, and it's getting dangerously close to effectively tip, that's a one-way door. And that's when a net carbon sink that's driving our effectively our weather systems, turns into a net carbon source.
Yep.
That is a terrifying prospect, and we're starting to hit the brink of that. So when, as an investor, you crack open your investments, you look at those supply chains right the way from illegal logging, right the way through to cattle ranching soy, to the roads that are being built to transport it, to the gigantic ports that are taking all those commodities, to underwriting the shipping that's carrying those climate and nature damaging commodities. There's a job for everyone to do here, but also an opportunity as well. And we have to accept that 50% of global GDP is highly or moderately dependent on well-functioning natural ecosystems. So if we want a healthy society, if we want a resilient economy, we've got a job to do, but we do have time. We don't have a choice. We need to really start now.
I think it's been brilliant talking to you today, Tanya, because I think if you sit wearing an insurance hat, there's no debate around climate. I mean, our statistics, both in terms of the frequency and severity of climate-related loss, are terrifying. The sea temperatures in the Atlantic at the moment are higher than they've ever been, worrying for the season that's coming ahead. But I think you tying the story back and reminding us, and we have needed to be reminded, that nature and biodiversity are all part of the same conversation, must be joined up, has been brilliant. So thank you very, very much for your time, and thank you for everything you're doing. It's brilliant.
Thank you.